The night was still, but the silence was deceptive. Over the waters of the vast estuary, the 16-kilometer bridge, once hailed as Russia's engineering pride, stood like a colossal iron spine, stretching into the blackness. For months, Russian forces had believed it was their lifeline, their unbreakable connection to the front lines. Convoys of tanks, armored carriers, fuel trucks, and supplies rumbled across it daily, carrying the weight of Moscow's war machine. But what the Russian generals thought was their strongest shield had become their greatest trap. Ukraine had been watching. For weeks, drones buzzed quietly above the skies, collecting every movement, every convoy schedule, every weakness in the bridge's defenses. Kiev's planners knew that if this connection snapped, the entire Russian front would collapse like dominoes. At 17 a.m., the first warning came. Radar operators near the bridge detected a blip. Fast, low, and steady. It must be a bird, one officer muttered lazily. But it wasn't. It was Ukraine's newest long-range drone, flying below radar arcs, invisible to Russian air defenses until it was too late. Seconds later, the night erupted. A deafening explosion tore through the steel beams, shaking the ground for kilometers. Fire rose into the sky as twisted metal rained into the dark waters. Russian soldiers stationed near the checkpoint screamed into their radios, but before they could respond, another strike followed. This time even stronger. The bridge groaned like a wounded beast. Entire sections collapsed, dragging vehicles into the sea. Trucks loaded with ammunition burst into fireballs, one after another, lighting up the night like a chain of suns. On the Russian side, chaos reigned. Commanders shouted conflicting orders. Hold the bridge. Retreat now. Defend the supply lines at all costs. But it was already too late. The bridge, once thought untouchable, was breaking apart piece by piece. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, Ukrainian officials watched a live drone feed in silence. The glowing screens reflected in their eyes as the impossible unfolded before them. One of them whispered, "The lifeline is gone." Another replied, "The front will starve." By dawn, Russian troops across the 16-kilometer front realized what had happened. Fuel trucks never arrived. Ammunition resupply was cut. Reinforcements were stranded on the other side of the broken bridge. What had been a well-supplied fortress just hours before had turned into an isolated pocket, vulnerable, exposed, and panicking. In Moscow, the Kremlin scrambled to control the narrative. State television called it a minor incident, blaming technical failures, but leaked soldier videos told the truth. Burning convoys, sinking armor, soldiers trapped and screaming for evacuation.
For the men on the ground, there was no propaganda strong enough to hide the reality. The Russian war machine, once feared, was now paralyzed. And Ukraine was preparing the next move. The strike wasn't just about destroying a bridge. It was about strategy, about cutting off the oxygen of an army that depended on a single fragile connection. It was about showing Russia that even its biggest, strongest structures could collapse with one precise strike. As the day dragged on, Russian commanders gathered in their bunkers, maps spread before them. They faced an impossible choice: launch a desperate counter-offensive to rebuild under fire, or retreat from the entire 16-kilometer front before it collapsed completely. But retreat meant humiliation. Retreat meant admitting that Ukraine had turned the hunter into the hunted. And so, orders came down: hold your ground. Reinforcements will arrive. But no reinforcements were coming. The bridge, Russia's biggest pride, had become the coffin of its army. The sun rose over the shattered steel, but it brought no warmth to the Russian soldiers trapped on the wrong side of the broken bridge. Smoke still curled into the sky from the twisted wreckage, carrying with it the smell of burning oil, rubber, and flesh. The once proud supply convoys now lay scattered at the bottom of the estuary, silent tombs beneath the water. For the soldiers on the front line, every second without supplies felt like a tightening noose. Their fuel was running dry, their rations were thinning, and their ammunition was being counted bullet by bullet. Men who once marched confidently now whispered in fear. Radios crackled with desperate voices. "Where is the next convoy? HQ, we're down to our last shells. My men haven't eaten in 2 days." But Moscow had no answers. The Kremlin's promises of reinforcements on the way were empty words, swallowed by the burning waters of the collapsed bridge. Ukraine knew this moment had arrived, the moment when an army, starved and cut off, would break. And so, the offensive began. High voltage at dawn, drones swarmed the skies again. They weren't just scouting this time, they were hunting. Russian trenches, artillery nests, and makeshift fuel depots were struck one by one. Soldiers scattered like ants under fire, but there was nowhere to hide. Without supplies, their air defenses were silent, their artillery muted, their tanks idle. Ukrainian armored columns pushed forward. Their advance was steady, methodical, and merciless. Villages once fortified by Russian troops fell within hours. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. Some soldiers raised white flags, their faces pale with exhaustion and hunger. On the Russian side, commanders clung to illusions. Hold the line, they ordered. Dig deeper trenches, fight to the last man. But their voices were hollow, their threats meaningless. Soldiers knew the truth. They had been abandoned. One captured Russian soldier, barely 20 years old, whispered to his Ukrainian captors. They told us the bridge was indestructible. They lied to us. They sent us here to die. In Moscow, panic spread behind closed doors. Advisors argued furiously. Should they risk another massive construction effort under Ukrainian fire? Or attempt dangerous ferry crossings across the waters? Every option was suicidal. Every day wasted meant another village lost, another battalion cut off. And yet, the Kremlin hesitated. Pride chained their hands. They could not admit defeat. As the days passed, the disaster deepened. Ukrainian forces encircled Russian positions, cutting off smaller groups of soldiers from each other. Some units tried to retreat through the marshes, only to be ambushed. Others dug shallow graves for their comrades before surrendering. The once strong 16-kilometer front had become a graveyard of rusting vehicles and abandoned weapons. For Ukraine, it was not just a military victory. It was psychological. The message was clear. Russia's greatest bridge, the backbone of its front, had turned into its greatest weakness. No structure, no matter how massive, could survive precision and patience. Internationally, the images spread like wildfire. Screens across Europe and America showed drone footage of the collapsed bridge, burning convoys, and surrendering soldiers. Commentators declared it a turning point in the war. In Russian cities, however, state TV tried to hide the truth. They called it temporary difficulties. But families of soldiers knew better. Their sons' desperate text messages, their last recorded calls, spoke of starvation, fear, and hopelessness. By the second week, the Russian line completely collapsed. Villages liberated, front lines pushed back, and Ukrainian flags rising where Russian banners once stood. And in the end, the bridge, once a symbol of Moscow's strength, had become a symbol of its greatest failure. The war wasn't over, far from it, but one truth now echoed across the world. When a giant builds its empire on a fragile bridge, all it takes is one strike for the empire to fall.